Turkmenistan, a country the size of California, sitting atop the world's fourth largest natural gas reserves. And almost no one from the outside world ever sees any of it. Only around 10,000 foreigners visit each year. Very few are Western journalists. Reuters hadn't been inside the country for the better part of a decade, until now.
Ashgabat is called the White City, and as you can see, it's very easy to tell why. For miles and miles around, all of the buildings are like this. All of them are clad in this incredible white marble.
This is On Assignment. On today's show, our correspondent Felix Light takes us inside this reclusive country and asks whether it's slowly opening up. I'm your host, Tara Oakes.
My name is Felix Light, and I'm Reuters' Central Asia correspondent based in Almaty in Kazakhstan.
Felix has spent years reporting across the former Soviet Union, Moscow, Georgia, the Caucasus. Turkmenistan, though, was different. We caught up with him shortly after he returned to get a sense of what he saw there.
So Turkmenistan, sort of for people who are follow and are involved in Central Asia, is always sort of a little bit of an odd one out. It's very hard to visit. It's generally seen as one of the sort of most reclusive countries, I would say, in the world. It's very, very difficult to get a visa. There's probably, I think, I understand it's about 10,000 foreigners visit Turkmenistan every year. So like very, very small numbers relative to sort of the world population and indeed relative to, I think, those who would want to go to Turkmenistan. It's a country that sort of operates on lines that are almost quite obscure and quite confusing, I think, to a lot of people outside. It's, as I say, it's very sealed off. It largely lives on sort of gas exports and occasionally makes the news for sort of various eccentric behavior by its ruling elite.
So given all this, we wanted to know how Felix got on if it's so impossible to visit.
Well, so put it simply, most often journalists do not get visas. Now, foreign journalists do go from sort of often especially from like the Russian or the Turkish press, countries that have reasonably good relations with Turkmenistan and are important in the region. But as I understand it, Reuters and Western media have not really been in the last 10 years prior to our trip. I wrote a very nice letter to the Turkmen embassy in Moscow, sort of requesting the visa, saying, we're interested in Turkmenistan because we are Reuters. We're very interested in sort of natural gas. We're very interested in geopolitics. We're very interested in a lot of the things that are at the heart of the Turkmen story. And a sort of process sort of unfolded thereafter. So they came back to me with a little accreditation card, which was proved to be completely magical in Turkmenistan, got me into a lot of places very easily, and invited me to apply for a visa. They gave me a visa for an entire year, which, I think is pretty much unheard of, certainly for a journalist.
The journey in, though, was a reminder of just how isolated Turkmenistan remains.
Yeah, so unlike the other four countries of Central Asia, there are very limited travel options to Turkmenistan. And to get to Turkmenistan, you essentially have to fly in via a number of, a couple of European capitals, but also big hubs like Istanbul or the Gulf cities. What you can't do right now, although they talk reasonably often about restoring direct flights from neighboring countries, is you can't fly in from anywhere that's particularly nearby. So in my case, I had to essentially fly from Almaty, 5 hours to Istanbul, a 6-hour layover in Istanbul airport, and then double back to Turkmenistan. So it was a day or more of travel to get there, even though had there been a direct flight, it would have been 2 hours away.
To understand the country's isolation, let's go back to how Turkmenistan became Turkmenistan.
A lot of people who come to Ashgabat say it's an empty city without any people. And in some of the central areas, a lot of the central areas, in fact, that is true. But really, you do just have to find the places where people congregate, where people come. And we came out to a residential area, to a fairly new supermarket here. And as you can see, there are people all around, there's food from all sorts of foreign brands. And interestingly, you might notice, a lot of the women come here in traditional Turkmen costumes, dresses and headscarves.
Turkmenistan was essentially the southernmost point of the former Soviet Union. So it sort of slots in above Iran, between Afghanistan and the Caspian Sea. And it is overwhelmingly desert. It is it's the Karakum Desert, the Black Sand Desert, as they call it in what the name means in Turkmen. And sort of under the Soviet Union, it was both essentially the last part of Central Asia that the Russians conquered. They only conquered it, I think, at the end of the 19th century. And it was the part of the Turkmens were the most stubborn resistors of the Russians as well. But then it was sort of formed into this Soviet Republic, the Turkmen Soviet Republic. And it was largely one of, I think, the poorest republics. It was very peripheral. It was a long way away from anywhere. And then sort of with the rest of Central Asia, you have this sort of independence sort of comes in 1991. And it's almost quite surprising, I think, because a lot of these countries are places that, that they had a history of independence, of sort of self-government, but probably not in the sense of being a state to the same extent, to the extent that we would recognize that term. And so sort of Turkmenistan in those first years of independence in the 1990s, initially it's quite a sort of normal Central Asian country. You have the pre-independence elite really sort of rebadges itself and becomes the sort of independence era elite around a guy called Saparmurat Niyazov, who was the last Soviet leader of Turkmenistan and also became the first independent leader of Turkmenistan. But then sort of things start to take this slightly unusual turn. The country starts to get very, very closed. It introduces what is and largely remains one of the most difficult visa regimes in the entire world. If you talk to sort of Turkmen officials, this is always framed as sort of a response to a very difficult geography. So it's not only sort of this idea that, Turkmenistan is this newly independent state and it wants to sort of corrode whatever leverage the old colonial power in Moscow might have over it, but it also wants to defend itself from sort of the negative impacts of its neighborhood. So you have Iran, the Islamic Republic next door, all of 30 miles, I think, from Ashgabat, so very, very close to the border. And then next door, you also have Afghanistan. And a lot of Turkmen who sort of dwell on that time will remember that sort of this push to close the borders was in part necessitated by the influx of sort of Afghan heroin to Turkmenistan in those sort of early and mid-90s. I think talking to locals, there's a sense that it was really, really bad, and there really was a sort of heroin epidemic at the time. This is when Afghanistan was in its sort of probably its lowest ebb in terms of its civil war. The communists had been ousted, but the Taliban hadn't sort of come in yet. So it really was a sense of sort of warlordism and anarchy and sort of a narco state right next door to Turkmenistan.
Felix says it spent 30 years trying not to be dependent on any of those neighbours.
Turkmenistan did a very great deal to avoid becoming dependent for its gas exports on Russia, because it was very afraid of sort of general dependency on Russia. And it moved towards China as its sort of as its main export partner for gas, for its economic staple, essentially. But one thing that I was quite struck by in Turkmenistan is that you will not see, certainly less than in other Central Asian countries, that visible Chinese influence. You don't really see Chinese cars on the streets. You don't really see Chinese brands. There aren't huge numbers of Chinese visitors either.
But Felix says it's not North Korea.
It's obviously an autocratic country. There's quite a lot of social control. Political control is very strict. And there is a sort of public veneration of the leadership, shall we say, in a way that can strike an incomer as quite odd. But, the whole thrust of our reporting was sort of to speak to people who are doing things that in any other country would be totally unremarkable, but they are doing them in Turkmenistan. And to show that sort of, that Turkmen society is, at least among a certain sort of perhaps Ashgabat upper crust, is actually not so different from any other country in the world. But also that there's this sort of expanding sort of grey zone of possibilities in which people can operate.
And while the country has been adamant about maintaining its economic independence, culturally is beginning to adopt a vibe of another country in the region, And despite historic links, it's not Russia.
Now, Turkmenistan for 70 years was part of the Soviet Union, and for that reason, a lot of older people especially still speak Russian to a very high degree. But if you hang around a little bit with the younger generation, I'm very struck by how influential Turkey is and Turkish culture. The Turkmen and Turkish languages are very similar. People are watching Turkish TV shows, and often people just speak Turkish on the street. If people are going out of the country to study, they're often going to Turkey. And so you really get a sense of how the cultural positioning of the country has shifted a little bit in 30 years of independence towards Turkey, I would say. We've come to, of all things, a breakdancing class here in the city of Ashgabat in a school gym. We've got kids of all ages practicing their breakdancing with their coach. Around the side, we've got some of their friends filming on Facebook and TikTok and Instagram. And really, I think what this shows us is that even here, in a country that was this traditionally isolated and cut off, you still have kids, increasingly, this younger generation, living a life that would be very recognizable to their peers in other countries. So even here, I think there's a sense of social and cultural change that's going on all the time, just under the surface.
The coach, Mohammed Bayram Galielet, who learnt to breakdance from VHS tapes on the street with no trainer, now runs an officially recognised federation and wants his students to compete internationally. It's one image of change. Here's another.
We're here at the offices of Wabroom, which is a Turkmenistan internet startup. It's sort of like an e-commerce company, similar to Amazon in the US or to Alibaba in China. So as you can see here on the screen, you can order, we put in boots, and we've gone for girls' boots, I think. So you can go through and you can browse and add them into your basket. And so this is very similar to sort of a million different companies around the world. But what's interesting here is that this is a country with relatively low internet usage and some restrictions on internet use. But even so, you can see a company just like any other in the world here, and a real sign that the economy and the society as well is modernizing and changing with time.
E-commerce is just on the earliest stage of development in Turkmenistan. And we can say that we are pioneers in this business, but it's developing quite fast, yes. As for now, we have 50 plus vendors on Wabroom. For small Turkmen market is quite a big number for early stages of development of our business.
That's Azat Sayed Mohamedov, who runs Wabroom.
Yeah, he was an interesting character because I think he sort of embodied that kind of boyish, optimism, can-do spirit that characterizes a lot of people in that sort of sphere. And of course, no one's saying that sort of Turkmenistan is an easy country to do that in, because there's not a lot of outside investment. The internet's very slow, and there are all sorts of like nuances to the way the economy works in terms of there being effectively two different differential rates for the dollar, and sort of it's a very difficult country to be doing that. But people still do it. You still have Instagram bloggers, and you still have sort of tech startups, right? And that sort of even in these circumstances, people can live lives that would be broadly comparable to those in literally any other country in the world.
One is Enerjan Velmoradova, who runs a travel agency and an Instagram blog in Ashgabat. In her spacious city centre office, decorated with social media certificates and fridge magnets from across the world, Velmoradova says she's glad her country is opening up. But she and Wabroom are exceptions to the rule in a country that still has a relatively low rate of internet usage. The internet in Turkmenistan is slow and heavily censored, which officials say is necessary to counteract militant Islamist ideas that have spread online in other Central Asian countries.
One thing that Ashgabat has no shortage of at all is luxury hotels. This is our hotel, the Sport Hotel. We've been staying here for the last 3 days. Up there, there's another one, the Olympic, and down there, there's probably half a dozen more. Now, some of them are frankly quite empty, but the Sport has actually been quite busy while we've been here. A lot of people coming through. It's one of the cheaper luxury hotels in Ashgabat, so that probably is in its favor. But the main thing that makes these places stand out is that this is Turkmenistan. This is a country with very limited access to the internet. A lot of core social media apps, whatever, those kind of things are blocked in Turkmenistan. But here in the hotels, you get free, uncensored internet. And that's a big deal here.
In 2022, Turkmenistan got a new president, Sardar Berdimuhamedov, the son of a former president who remains in a powerful advisory role. Felix says there are signs that something is shifting.
There's a sense that there's a sort of generational change and generational renewal underway in the elite and in the government, and that is generally more favourable to sort of engage a little bit more engagement with the outside world and a little bit more sort of generally modern way of doing things, I think. It's not a huge change, but I think things are underway, things are developing.
Thanks to Felix for his time and reporting. We had one more question for him. Does he want to go back?
Yes, I certainly intend to go back. So, as I said, I was given a year-long visa to Turkmenistan back in autumn last year. So my visa's good until September, and I'm hopeful of getting another one. And as I say, I think it's an absolutely beguiling, fascinating country, and I would absolutely love to go back.
This episode was produced by David Spencer and me, senior producer Tara Oakes. Musical composition and sound design is by Josh Sommer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Gail Issa, Christopher Wall-Jasper, Mindy Burrows, Sharon Roche-Garson, Abisoye Adelusi, Ethan Plotkin, Eliza Davis-Beard, Alex Summer, Sebastian Summer, and Jonathan Stayers. Our other senior producers are Carmel Crimmins and Jonah Green. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. For daily news from around the world, listen to Reuters World News, now available 7 days a week and on video too. Subscribe or ask your smart speaker to play the latest news from Reuters. We'll be back with another On Assignment next weekend.